closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
Teaching can sometimes get a little dull, prepping students for a test or teaching a canned curriculum. But what if a school was also about cultivating students to be caring, community-involved citizens and creative thinkers who love to read? That's the premise of this new book we'll be discussing today on The Professors. Joining me today to talk about the book entitled Caring Hearts and Critical Minds is the book's author, Stephen Wolk, who is a professor at Northeastern Illinois University. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Stephen, let's talk about the credentials. What makes you the right person to talk about this book?
Well, I'm passionate.
Well, not talk about this book, but to present this topic. I'm sorry.
I've been working in education for 25 years. I was an elementary and middle school teacher for 9 years, and I've been teaching at Northeastern for about 15 years. I'm in schools all the time. I'm in Chicago public schools all the time, working with teachers, working with students, and I'm passionate about the ideas in that book. I've been writing about them for a long time, and I think probably, I'd say the two things that probably stand out for me the most is first, I'm a passionate reader. You know, I love reading and I love books.
Now, you say in your book, though, becoming a passionate reader happened kind of later on in life. It wasn't.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, because that's kind of the other thing, and that is that I grew up as a non-reader. I hated reading. I mean, reading was, I'd rather do anything than read a book as a kid. I mean, and in high school, I read one book. I fake read my way through high school, which is how most people go through high school. They get assigned a lot of books, but they don't really read them because they're not interested in what they're being told to read.
Now, let me ask you this. So in this book, what we're talking about is how do we use reading in order to help cultivate social responsibility, civic engagement, things of that nature, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. So then how do we know that this method will not, will deter more fake reading?
I think that, well, first of all, you're using books that are, the whole premise of the book and what we did in the book, what I did in the book, is to use children's literature, to use books that are written for middle grade and young adults. These are books that are about middle grade and young adult kids. So they're books about, with characters that the kids can identify with. I mean, when I was in high school, I was given books. Almost every book I was told to read was about adults.
That's true.
I was 15 years old, 14 years old, 16 years old. I didn't care about adults. I wanted to read about things that adolescents were dealing with. So the books that we use, and the idea of the book was that, you know, I took a year working with 6 middle school teachers, and we co-designed and co-taught these units using middle grade and young adult literature. And so I was in there with the teacher, co-teaching with them. And I saw the excitement. I see the excitement of students when they're reading books that they love. They don't want to finish them. I mean, they can't wait to finish them. Actually, right. You know, they're truly engaged in reading of the book. And by connecting that book to life, by connecting that book to real issues that are relevant to their lives, that are relevant to the world, that are important, that matter, school becomes something that's important and relevant rather than just passing another test.
Now let me ask you this, and if I were a parent, not a teacher, I'm a parent, what are 5 things I need to know about this book?
As a parent?
Yeah, as a parent.
I'd say the first thing is the ideas in the book that teachers can use in their classroom will encourage your child to become a reader.
Okay.
It'll encourage your child to become a thinker. It will hopefully encourage your child to understand their role and responsibility in life and to care about people, to care about the world, to be involved in the world, to understand our responsibilities living in a democracy. And I think probably more than anything else is that they'll become more engaged readers and thinkers, and they'll realize that there are some amazing books out there that aren't just about important ideas, but they're great stories, and they're written beautifully.
And what are 3 other things as a parent, what should I take away from reading this book?
that there are a lot of different ideas that we can use in teaching than just what they're hearing in the media. That I would also say that that a lot of the political speeches about school reform don't really get at the heart of what needs to be done in schools. That really, some of the most important ideas are we need to change what we're teaching and how we're teaching. It's about curricular issues. It's about how we're teaching. It's about the aims of schooling. You know, most politicians, when they make a talk about education, they look at schooling as entirely about preparing kids for a world of work. They look at schools as preparing workers.
As opposed to preparing
human beings.
Yeah, citizens.
Human beings, citizens, world citizens, people with global awareness. You know, to me, being an educated human being is not about preparing someone strictly for their life of employment. And so the ideas in the book and the ideas of this teaching are about really rethinking the purpose and aims of education, that they're not just about employment, they're just not economic purposes. It's not just about, you know, the quote you keep hearing over and over again from politicians and education leaders is, we need schools, we need school reform in order to win the 21st century global economy. And yet, if you ask any teacher why they became a teacher, they don't say, because I want to increase the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
This is true.
You know, I mean, they're in there because they have a much deeper passion, and they want to engage their students in that passion, to make them lifelong learners, to make them engage with the world, to make them care. And so it's really the ideas in the book and the ideas about reading are about cultivating human beings.
Now, let me ask you this, because what we're talking about here now are the Common Core standards, right? And you're quite...
In what way? I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, when we talk about the politicians are coming forth and they're saying, you know, we need to have a curriculum that prepares people for the workforce, and then that gets blended into the discussion of we need to reinvent, once again, retool the curriculum because they're not meeting their certain performance expectations. So now we have this performance-based curriculum, if you will. And so now we have the Common Core standards. And so they're supposed to be rolling out in 2014.
Right.
Exactly how, knowing what you know about your passion, about where you think the curriculum should be and what the Common Core standards are, how do you educate your students? What do you say in the classroom?
Well, you know, the thing is, to be a teacher, being a teacher is complex because on one hand, you know, there are requirements for teachers, and teachers are inundated with requirements every day, you know, and there's more and more, it seems like every day, and teachers are overwhelmed. You know, right now, in fact, you know, I've worked in education for 25 years, and it really, it's incredibly distressing right now in education because the morale in schools and the morale of teachers is the lowest I've ever seen in 25 years because of the pressure they're under just simply to get test scores up. And it doesn't teach critical thinking, it doesn't teach creative thinking, it doesn't teach humanitarianism, it doesn't teach caring, it doesn't teach civic responsibility. And so one of the arts and crafts of teaching is not just learning about pedagogy and the art of how do you actually teach students and get them engaged. It's learning how to kind of work the system. You know, just like kids kind of have to learn the game of school, teachers also have to kind of learn the game of being a teacher. And part of that is understanding that, yeah, there are these requirements that I have to do as a teacher. And there are some. It's true of any job, right?
Correct.
But there's also, why am I in the classroom? What are my personal passions? What do I think are the real aims of education, you know? And so one of the crafts of teaching is figuring out how to combine those two and still keep your job and still be happy and still meet the requirements you have to meet. So it's really about this seeing yourself as a collaborator. But I think that one of the problems right now is that teachers don't see themselves as being respected and honored in that respect. They're just simply being told what to do. And I mean, if we really want to change our schools, we need to empower teachers. We need to give them the power to unleash their passion. I mean, I have students at Northeastern, so many of my students, they're just phenomenal, and they're just waiting to be empowered to go into classrooms and transform their schools. But in order to do that, I think the system needs to honor their passions. It needs to honor why they became a teacher. And so it needs to be a true collaboration. And I think that's actually what we did in the book, because it was really, the bulk of the book is about me working with these 6 middle school teachers to design these units and teach them. And these teachers they're fantastic. I mean, they're in the classroom and they're working tirelessly, but they're also saying part of this job, part of what I'm doing has to be about what I think is important. And that's about cultivating human beings.
Okay. And let me ask you this, because I like the quote that you mentioned in chapter 4 when we were talking about teaching for social responsibility. And you said, even considering my earlier criticism of the Common Core, if you peruse the standards, you will see that they don't dictate what books students should read or how you should teach. The standards do dictate that students read a variety of literary and informational texts, as well as learn critical thinking skills, understand diverse perspectives and cultures, and build strong content knowledge. And you said these are all components central to social responsibility, teaching through inquiry, and literature-based teaching. So when you are in the classroom and you're teaching your students how to be creative around teaching around this Common Core, how often do you refer back to your project of this reading project?
To my own students at Northeastern?
Yeah.
I show them examples from the book. I mean, it's relatively new. I mean, the book just came out earlier this year. So I show my students some of the work the students did, the middle school students did. We read some of the books that they've read.
And let's talk about some of the examples. So the way the book flows is that we have the first beginning chapters pretty much gives us the background of why you wrote the book, why is it important. And then I say around about chapter 7 is when we start talking about the different topics, right? Well,
Right,
no,
yeah.
chapter 7 is about just, yeah. These are their different ideas on how we can teach certain concepts through these books.
Yeah, the way it kind of works is probably about the first quarter of the book kind of takes you through. I mean, the book kind of brings together 5 educational ideas. One is teaching with middle grade and young adult literature. I mean, books that are specifically written for middle grade students and young adults. So these are books somewhat, I mean, written for kids 8 to 12 and 12 to 18 years old.
Got it.
So we're reading books that are actually about kids. The second thing is inquiry-based teaching, which isn't a new idea. John Dewey advocated it. Other people advocated it 100 years ago. The thing is they were just ignored 100 years ago.
And you know, the thing I find about it is that even though we're calling it inquiry-based learning, it's like it's the same thing, but someone just puts a different name on it. It's almost like they're doing a remarketing of the same concept.
Sometimes that happens, absolutely, yeah.
So I understand what you're saying about inquiry-based learning.
And then project-based learning, and project-based learning was advocated strongly 100 years ago. And so inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, using children's and young adult literature, and social responsibility, which I kind of divide in the book, much broader than simply kind of civics or something, but because that could include understanding of government systems, that could include staying current on social problems, understanding that we need to engage in conversations with our friends and family about what's going on in the world, what's going on in the country, moral and ethical dimensions of decision-making every day. It's caring and empathy. Part of what I'm advocating here is making explicit, helping to develop in children a sense of caring and empathy. And so it's taking these ideas, and then the one more piece is connecting the books to real-world resources that really can engage students. Newspaper articles, editorials, op-ed pieces, poetry, music, song lyrics, videos, music videos, news reports. The world is full of amazing resources. And what I'm advocating here is bringing those resources into the classroom to really engage students in these issues that are really important. And so before they even start reading a book, they may read lyrics to a rap song and discuss the lyrics of a rap song. And then listen to the song and discuss the song. And then they might read an op-ed piece in the New York Times. In one of the units that we did, and starting in chapter 7 that you referred there, each of those chapters is a separate unit that we did. The teacher and I designed and taught on a book. And so in inquiry-based teaching, you're really focusing the unit around questions. So the title of each unit is a question. Right? So for example, one of the units was called, does technology always make life better? So instead of saying to these 7th graders, we're going to read a book so you can become a better reader, no, we said, we began the first day with that question up on the board. Does technology always make life better? And we were able to engage these 7th graders in looking at technology and especially media in their own lives. And then we were able to connect that later on to a novel we read, a novel that the kids couldn't put down. And they realized that they weren't just reading a book. We were exploring a real issue about real life. And it was relevant to them and important to them.
And you notice, of course, the quality of their engagement is totally different.
Totally different. Totally different. I mean, not only do they really want to read the book, and here's the thing, you know, there's a sequel to some books. I have been in classrooms where I've read a book that a lot of kids would never touch on their own. But you teach that in a unit, and you really engage students. And if there's a sequel to that book on the shelf, half the class will run to that shelf and grab the sequel.
Now, let me ask you this then, because now we're talking about the relevancy of books, and you know, I am a librarian. One of the concerns I do have is this increasing trend about the lack of libraries in our schools. And it is as if they're sending this message about the irrelevancy of libraries in the life of the user. How do you respond to that? Because I notice your book is specifically talking about classroom libraries. And very briefly, you do talk about working with librarians and things of that nature to help identify these texts. But where does the role of an academic, the role of the library in the school come into play into this conversation? Or is this part of the whole, this is one of the ways to deal with not having a library in your school?
Well, the school library is incredibly important. Every school should have a library. Every school should be overflowing in books. You know, there's so much political speeches and rhetoric about, you know, we need to have kids become better readers and, you know, with test scores. There's one thing we know in education for a fact, and that is that if you want kids to be good readers, they need to read a lot. They need voluminous reading, a lot of reading. And when we talk about a lot of reading, you could read articles and books written by teachers. Their students read 20, 30, 40 novels a year. Most students aren't reading 4 novels a year. And they're reading 30 or 40 novels a year. And they're doing that because they're immersed in literature that they want to read. So a school library is extremely important. It's very important to have a good library. And a good librarian is absolute gold.
Let me ask you this. So the teachers that you worked with 7, correct? 6. In any of those 6 schools, was there a library?
Yeah, there were there were libraries in some of those schools, and some of them were good libraries. In all honesty, I don't think I've ever been in a Chicago public school that had a great, well, maybe one that had a great library.
Yeah, I know one off the top of my head.
Right,
too.
there aren't many, and you know, the truth is,
it actually had a librarian.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the first schools the first schools I taught in Chicago many years ago, the school, the CPS said that the school didn't have enough kids in it, so we were only awarded half a librarian. And I'm like which half, you know? But the library was so poor, so horribly poor, that the principal did the wise decision and just locked the door and used that money for the half a librarian on something else, because there's no point in having it anyways. But
doesn't that just send a horrible message about the role of reading and even information literacy?
Absolutely. I mean, if we want readers, we need kids and books just full. We need classrooms and schools full of books. Books everywhere. And the only way we're going to do that is really engage kids in reading is if they're absolutely immersed in books that they want to read. And that's where classroom libraries come in, because the idea of a classroom library is to make it as easy as possible to give kids access to books. Access to books is one of the key factors in getting more kids to read more books. Make it easy. And it's not just having a class library, it's the design of a class library. It's how you actually design a class library to entice kids and to make it so they can see books easily and they can find books easily that they're interested in reading. But the idea, we need school libraries, we need school librarians that are experts in literature that kids want to read, that can encourage kids to read, and then we need classroom libraries that are filled with books that kids want to read. Not necessarily books that adults think they should be reading,
Exactly.
but books that kids want to read.
The kids want to read.
Right.
Let me ask you this. So in your book, one of the previous shows, I have several soapboxes, but one soapbox I stood very firmly on is like, I refuse to have a conversation with anyone that talks about curriculum reform or anything of that nature if they have not read The 21st Century Learner. And I was so delighted to see that you did reference it in your book, talking about, you know, the 21st Century Learner, these are what the outcomes should be. But I noticed that in your book, you talked about inquiry-based learning and you talked about the role of media literacy and critical thinking. But I'm wondering, how do we get to that if we don't even talk about information literacy? Or maybe maybe a different approach to the question would be, so at what point when we're going through this process with our middle-aged students, does information literacy begin to play I don't want to say a major role, but becomes a major player in this whole design?
Let me first by asking, how do you define information literacy? What does that mean to you?
To me, information literacy means it's a person's ability to identify, to evaluate, and to research that information, to do a critical evaluation, to know where to find those resources and things of that nature, to know how to use a library, to know how to evaluate. And so when we're talking about inquiry-based learning, I notice here that you, in chapter 13, you talk about how can we engage students in observing closely and describing what's there, considering different viewpoints and perspectives, evaluating evidence, arguments, and action, identifying claims, assumptions, and bias. This is pretty much the premise of information literacy. So at some point, where does information literacy play into this design?
I think it plays in the entire design. Our schools today, our schools that we have today and the curriculum we have today were designed for my grandparents. My grandparents went to Chicago Public Schools 100 years ago. They were sitting in Chicago public classrooms. And we're still basically teaching that curriculum. We're still teaching a curriculum and we're still educating children for the Industrial Revolution. And kids know how irrelevant it is.
They do.
They have smartphones, they have the internet. They know that life is so much more interesting than school.
Yeah.
And they also know that life is in the current time. It's in the 21st century, and our schools are not. And so...
So let me ask you this then. Why don't they get it?
Who's they?
You know who they are. How come they that create the Common Core, they that are the politicians, how come they don't get it? Or is it just that they don't want to get it?
Well, I think part of it is that they're not educators. You have people who aren't educators and aren't teachers trying to reform schools. It's not going to work because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. And they're also making decisions based on the assumptions they have. And one of the biggest assumptions they have is that the purpose of school is to create workers. And that's why, really, we have the Common Core. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with the Common Core. There are certain elements that I think are valid. I mean,
it kind of helps to raise the bar, I agree.
Students are never going to learn the information literacy you're talking about. They're never going to learn the ability to read critically and have critical thinking about what they read unless they read really good, interesting, relevant, informational texts.
But there was some would say, if we were having a cocktail conversation, and so we're talking about a conspiracy theorist, so some would say, well, it's not in the best interest of developing a workforce full of critical thinkers.
I would say there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, there is. I mean, that's the idea of teaching for critical literacy, where you go beyond just critical thinking, and you really educate a society and people that are critically literate. When you're critically literate, you look at power structures in society, who has power, who doesn't have power, how is power used and abused.
You start questioning things.
You start questioning the status quo. You start questioning things about who has power and who doesn't have power.
And then eventually the student will say, well, how come I don't have any power?
Why don't I have any power? Or why is this, why do I have such little voice in school? Why am I never given any choice in school? Why am I never allowed to think for myself in school? Why do I keep giving, why am I given a textbook that has canned knowledge in it all the time? Yeah, you start asking questions, There are a lot of people that don't want a populace to ask questions, But I would say that I think that you have people, you have politicians, you have educational leaders who still look at school in terms of the only purpose they really serve is an economic purpose. So
Yeah.
they think we just, in order to create workers, what do we have to do? My argument is, this is about getting an education. Getting an education is a human thing. It's a
Right.
life thing. It's not just a work thing. And until we redefine, until we really engage people in this conversation about what's the purpose of school, we're going to keep fighting an uphill battle, because there are people that, that are not visionaries at all. And they're actually pushing schools that are actually designed for my grandparents.
Yeah, I can totally agree with you on that one. My children are in CPS, and I'm I want to say I was watching them very closely, but I guess what I should say, I want to work with them as closely as possible, because I know they always talk about, the parents aren't engaged, but I think it's a partnership. It's a partnership between the parents, between the school teachers, and between the administrators, even if the administrators don't want to be a part of the conversation. So
Right.
what I'd like to do is, I know we're going to do our online discussion. In the online discussion, I want to talk about some of these really great books.
Okay,
As
great.
you know, I'm a librarian, so I always refer to books as delicious. So we're going to
I
talk
like
about some
it.
of these really delicious books that we should definitely eat more often. If you had any closing remarks, if you had any advice for an administrator, what would you say?
Wow. As a school administrator?
Yep.
Empower your teachers. Ask hard questions about, are we engaging our students? Are our students really interested? Do they come to school excited about learning? What are we having them read?
What are we having them read?
What are we having them read?
That's good. I think that's a good way to end it. What are we having them read? Thanks for coming.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
All right, that's our show for today. The conversation continues online at WYCC.org. See you next time on The Professors.